ecologically very well, then that's really important. And those landscapes are actually the ones that are degrading most severely around the world in terms of desertification, that they are drying out. Okay, so I can talk more about that in a bit. So that's holistic management. And then permaculture has developed in a different way. That's well, I'm gonna turn over to what the similarities are and how these different movements define themselves, are defined. And then I'm going to share what I've learned from a few people who have combined the two, because that's what intrigued me, is that it seemed like these two separate realms that are sort of like looking at each other from across the street. But as I'm finding, there's more and more integration. I think that's wonderful because each has a lot to offer for people who work the land, whether it's restoring, whether it's farming, whether it's as homeowners. So anyway, there we go. So a couple of similarities that I found about these two approaches to land management are: one, they're both hard to define. I'll give you some attempts at definition in a few minutes. They were popularized and developed by people on the geographic fringe, which I think is kind of interesting. Alan Savory, who developed holistic management, is from Zimbabwe, and which is, not a country we hear about. It's not, kind of in the center of where conversations are being brought forth for the public to engage with. And permaculture was developed by Bill Mollison, who's from, he passed away a few years ago, from Tasmania. So that's pretty out there. And I think that's, the reason I think that's worth mentioning is that often it's people on the fringe, geographically or otherwise, that have the kind of space to explore and maybe have some of the environmental challenges that they're dealing with in a much more right, upfront, and personal way. Whereas in a country like the US, sometimes we've been able to avoid what challenges, or not let ourselves not see so clearly some of the challenges that we have. We can sort of fudge things a bit, whereas in Zimbabwe, the circumstances were very stark, and the same is true of Tasmania, very separate from the rest of the world. And both of them draw on indigenous knowledge, and that's something that a lot of people, as we move into the next generations, subsequent generations of practitioners of these different approaches, are making that much more visible. And both are proactive rather than reactive. And I think that's important because often we, our dealings with landscapes, we kind of let things go, and then there's a problem and we react. And both of these approaches encourage us to think ahead. How are we going to deal with subsequent seasons? How are we going to, what will the landscape look like when these plants and including trees mature? Can we anticipate, this is in permaculture, can we anticipate the kind of shade that we will have when these trees grow? And how do we need to plan for that? And both are iterative, meaning that that we're responding and learning. So one of the things, so it's not just, okay, we've put the plan in, but that does this, so we put this plan into process, but is it working? How do we need to adjust it? So one of the things that struck me with holistic management, a few things, is that I remember on some of my in my early reporting, a rancher said that they like that you always put the plan in pencil and you only write it in pen later on, so for your record keeping, and how holistic management takes the pressure off from having to always be right. So you assume that you're wrong. You say, okay, we're going to need this number, or we're going to have this number of animals, and we're going to manage them in this particular way, have them move through the different paddocks at such and such a pace. But we know we're going to be wrong because we know that circumstances will change. So we're going to keep checking in with ourselves to see how things look and how we can take that formulated, written down in pencil plan and, do some erasing and some, adjusting to that plan. So I just, so those are some similarities. So right now I am going to share some slides. And this mouse is not behaving. Funny, since like it started to be spring, like this mouse is just not behaving itself. I almost said herself. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Well, and it knows you're online, so.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, it does, and it's not letting me. Well, here, let me just try this other way. I'll try to share the screen first and then see if it gives me a whole. Okay, share screen. And there. Okay. So this is how Bill Mollison, so now we're back, so we're looking at the definitions of these. And I started to understand, I took a permaculture design course in the fall, late summer into fall. And I thought it was interesting that part of our homework was to come up with our own definition of permaculture. So that in itself says that it can be a personal vision of that it's adjustable in a way that you can make meaning of it. So here's what this is Bill Mollison's definition of that: permaculture is the conscious design and maintenance of agricultural productive systems which have the diversity, stability, and resilience of natural ecosystems. Now, hold on to that. And this is another example from Permaculture Women. Permaculture is a way of designing the world we want to live in that cares for the earth and people so that all needs are met in an equitable way. They don't conflict for sure, but they bring forth different priorities. And this also suggests that ethics are part of the model of permaculture. And indeed, this is sort of, people talk about this as the core of permaculture: earth care, people care, and sharing of the surplus. As for holistic management, this is how the Savory Institute defines it. Holistic management uses a decision-making process to help ensure that the actions taken to restore land and livelihoods are ecologically, socially, and economically sound based on the context described by the people involved. So the way that in the past I had thought about it is that permaculture stresses design. That's what permaculture brings to the management of land: a design approach. And holistic management is a decision-making approach. So those are the different flavors. I've learned a lot from both. And as I said, I've been intrigued that they rarely intersect. And then as I explored, I looked out for people who do both. So I turned to them for insights. So now I'm going to introduce you to Dakota Cohen, who is the young fellow at the right. Those are his parents. The Cohen family farm is in Alberta. There's a little, you look north, okay, so you go to Wisconsin, center of the world, of course. You go north and then you go west and you see a little square. So that is where their farm is in Alberta. And I met Dakota at there's a Canadian organization, Regeneration Canada, that puts on a wonderful conference every year, the Living Soil Symposium. And I moderated the panel that he was on, and I was very intrigued that he did combine the two, and was also very intrigued by his stories. So the farm has been in the family for many generations, and he showed a photo of the family farm from the 1800s, where on the plus side, they had access to water. Water was available. The wells did not have to be that deep, but the people, the family, his ancestors, were dirt poor, and it was a pretty, vivid picture that he showed. And he said that when the land came down to his parents, that the watershed had deteriorated and the land had dried out to the point where they needed to drill down 30 feet or more to get at water. And he grew up one of 6 children on this organic farm, and they struggled. It was extremely, there he is with his parents, it was extremely hard to make a living. So all of the kids left. They said, I don't want any part of this. So Dakota goes on, and he's, exploring different things in his life in his 20s, and became aware of, as he was focusing on a lot of global challenges, he decided that agriculture, though he wanted to escape it, actually presented the best opportunity to address these global challenges. So he came back, and he began, so he was working on organic farming with his parents, and then he discovered permaculture. And that, he said, it really clicked for him, and that was his orientation. Just, he got all in on permaculture. He dove into it. Then he started to have failures. And what he realized is that he missed goal setting. Permaculture didn't give him kind of a framework for dealing with communication, staff relationships, and decision making. And so then he explored holistic management as well. So I'll share a little bit about his work. So mainly the big permaculture tool that he used was Swales. Because water was such a challenge, sorry about stuff going on in the house, because water was such a challenge, he needed to bring more water into the landscape. So Swales is a very important permaculture tool. Like all permaculture tools, not appropriate for all context. I was intrigued that so the permaculture design course that I took, it was in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts, about an hour and 20 minutes from me. And we have an active list. We write to each other with what we're doing and ask each other questions. And someone was writing, well, I don't know if I need swales, but I want swales. And that just showed me how, even though it's not for all contexts, we learn about these cool tools in permaculture, and there's a temptation to want to use all of them. So swales are put in on contour. That means that it's how the water would flow. And so that's a particular tool that you use, is to find the contours of the land and put them in. So that is what Dakota did. So they didn't have to go down within about 5 years. They were able to steer all the rainfall that they got. The swales collected the rainfall, and then they're able to use that for the farm rather than digging deeper and deeper for irrigation. So that is what he's doing. And here's an example of how he put in the swale and how it looked a few years later, that same spot. And then a few years after that. And all of this was within 5 or 6 years. The way he described it is that permaculture gives you a toolkit with the best snap-on tools that you can use, and holistic management helps you choose which tools are the right things to use for the right circumstances. And he highlighted that for both methods, the core principle is biomimicry. You are mimicking natural processes. And the core component that you, the land manager, brings to it is observation. Now we're going to learn a little bit from another practitioner whose name is Owen Hablatzel. And here he is in the cowboy hat. And it's funny, I didn't know that he also practiced permaculture. He's this, handsome cowboy that I would always see at various holistic management conferences. But indeed, he does do both. He says that he teaches them together, and he does a lot of keyline design. Keyline is when you're finding the contour for where to put in the swales. So you're working with how the land is shaped and where to make the most important interventions. And he says that he looks at the keyline scales of permanence, which I think that I have a slide on. Yeah. So the scale of permanence in permaculture is basically, what do you have? What can you change? What are you best able to change versus what is hardest, if not impossible, to change? In other words, what are the circumstances that one must just deal with? Like, that is the lot that you're given on that landscape. And the most permanent, this goes from the most permanent to the least permanent. The climate, you can't change. The land shape, you can't change. You can work within it through swales, through terracing, etc. The water supply, again, you can work with it and you can enhance it. But if you're in a desert, you need to acknowledge that you're in a desert. And for a particular plot of land, you have to acknowledge what you have and don't have, and including the human-derived water supply. So for an example, my permaculture design teacher came to our property, and I had initially thought, well, we've got this meadow up at the top of the driveway, but wouldn't it be great to plant stuff, put in plants and trees, maybe a food forest up there? And then she emphasized that there is no available water there, and it would be hard to bring water up there. So that's something one has to consider. There are things that we could do with it. We could harvest water there. We could put in a little pond, but we have to, but that's something to consider. Roads and access, trees, because trees are part of the infrastructure, the basic structures, the houses, subdivisions and fences that are there, and the soil. And the soil is what we have the most agency in working with. So Owen talks about how permaculture has great principles, but holistic management has done a lot more work in developing them, the principles, to specific actionable intelligence. So as an example, he talks about how permaculture, they talk about working with nature, which is a great concept, but in itself, saying that is obscure and abstract, whereas holistic management breaks it down to 4 ecosystem processes. So you can observe the water cycle, the mineral cycle, the energy cycle, and the carbon cycle, and that is what you are analyzing when you are putting together your plan for holistic management. So that level of assessment, Owen says, gives us practical tools in and of themselves. Also, he talked about when it comes to the holistic context. So in permaculture, you're encouraged to come to, you put together a design. With holistic management, you begin with your own context. And I've worked with different people in holistic management who come up with a different holistic context or goal. And that might not be evident from what they're doing. I remember when I interviewed a farmer who in North Dakota who worked with holistic management, and his holistic context was basically farming and ranching with the goal of increasing biodiversity. Because he found that when he was enhancing biodiversity, everything else improved. He was able to meet all of his other goals. So his other goals of increasing production and working in a way that enhanced his life experience, those became sub goals within the overall goal of enhancing biodiversity. So Owen found that having the holistic goal and involving the quality of life was really important to keeping him on track. So it helps you spell out what quality of life actually means for you. So this is a holistic context. It's looking at quality of life, looking at the forms of production, which would be whether it's enhancing land, because I know people who do holistic management and the overall goal is to restore the landscape. And other forms of production are the yield from the plants, the yield from the livestock, and the future resource base is what you're doing with the enhancement of the landscape. You're ensuring the future resource base. And so he's saying that the abstract permaculture ethics, so he said that there's a parallel between caring for people, caring for earth, and sharing the surplus, that there's a parallel with the holistic context of focusing on your quality of life. That's people care. Earth care is the future resource base, and the forms of production is the focus on production that allows you to ensure that there is a surplus to be shared. So he says that taking those abstract permaculture ethics to so that you can work from a specific and operational base, where it slightly reverses, he says, when it comes to land planning, and that permaculture has a lot to offer. For example, on the zones. This makes me smile because Katie Shepard is the artist here, and she does lovely work. She's a permaculture designer and someone who follows holistic management and may have implemented that in her own work. And she's a lovely artist. So in permaculture, you look at the zones of place. So zone 0 is where you are. Zone 1 is where you interact with quite frequently. So like right outside, the driveway, the pathway. Zone 2 is what you interact with a little bit less frequency. Let's say an herb garden that is just outside. And then zone 3 and zone 4, zone 5 would be places that you don't interact with very much. And that's very helpful when you are putting together a design, because it doesn't make sense to put an herb garden far away from your kitchen, for example. Now, this is very personal because you may choose for other reasons that you build into your design to have a garden a little further away. And that's what I do. And I realize that because I enjoy being in a different zone when I'm gardening, a different, emotional as well as physical zone. The next person I talked to is Dow Orion, who is a permaculture teacher in Oregon. And I didn't know that she also did permaculture. That she also did holistic management until recently. She said that in permaculture courses, holistic management is a good way to encapsulate how to think about land. Also, she's finding it valuable to really in helping clients by helping them to figure out what their holistic context is. It really grounds people in what is important to them, as opposed to what cool things are other people doing that I might do. So that's a really important distinction. So how is what you are doing in your design reflecting your vision for your life? And it also allows for relationship dynamics and dealing with worker relationships. She said that in consulting and permaculture, she often finds using holistic management, the kinds of questions that you are encouraged to ask in holistic management and to keep checking back, that she often finds herself talking people out of things, being a reality check, saying, yeah, I know that an herb spiral sounds really dandy, but let's really look at how much time you have, how much time you want to devote to your working on the land, how much money you have, what are your other resources? Is this the best thing for you to do given your own holistic context? And she says that in permaculture, there's the notion that I'm just going to do all this stuff and it will all work out. It's actually tremendously romantic. With holistic management, they're always bringing in the economic piece and encouraging you to do a business plan. So my holistic management training was, I've been following people and following projects for many years, but in terms of training, I actually went to the new Cowgirl camp in Eastern Washington 2 years ago, or I guess it's 3 years ago now. And so I figured, if I'm going to be writing about this stuff, I might as well learn how to do it. So the summer of 2018, I did 2 things. We had sheep on our landscape, sheep on our property. We live on 12 acres, much of which is forested in southwestern Vermont. And we had the experience of moving the sheep from paddock to paddock, setting up the fences, getting the fences all twisted and having to untwist them, and looking at the land and saying, oh my goodness, we need to move the sheep again. Gosh, can't we squeeze a few more hours, or can't we wait till tomorrow morning? But no, you really have to respond to what the land is telling you. And we learned really quickly how to do so, in part because the sheep would tell you, because when they're bleeding and complaining, you got to listen. And I learned the hard way that you can't impose your will on the sheep. So I remember that summer. It was a few days that my husband was away, so I had to do all the sheep moving, and the sheep were bleeding and complaining. And I went down there to the paddock and where they were, and I saw that there was more grassy stuff. So I thought, well, you have more. What are you complaining about? We can squeeze, I can wait till tomorrow morning. So I waited till the next morning, and then I moved it. And then a friend of mine came over that day, and she is someone who had done some sheep herding in the Pacific Northwest in her younger years, in her 20s. And she said, oh my gosh, that's cheatgrass. They won't eat that. And then she said, now you can see that they really are starting to damage the land, that they were really eating way down to the ground and scratching a little bit. So we quickly, I saw that, and I just vowed not to let them go on too long. But anyway, that was one experiment in holistic management. But I'm happy to say that after the sheep were here, the land looked great. I'm lucky that being in a place like this, you can get away with making a few mistakes like that. And so the land looked great, and those sheep were really, really healthy when they went back to their owner. So that was a success and a learning opportunity. And then I went to the new cowgirl camp, and I was really surprised so this was a week of women getting together at the Lazy R Ranch in Cheney, Washington. And it was fabulous. And I was so inspired by not only the teachers, Beth Robinette and Sandra Matheson. Beth is young and, funny and full of offbeat observations. And Sandra is my age and has been a veterinarian for many years. So they brought different perspectives. So that was really a lot of fun. But also the women that came to this camp, who just, I couldn't imagine in my 20s feeling that it was within the realm of possibility that a young woman could have her own animal operation. I was just so thrilled at the empowered feeling that everybody had. But what surprised me is that a lot of the work we were doing was about the holistic context and the business plan and planning for profitability, always making sure that you pay yourself first, that you're building the profit in, because too many people don't do that. They sort of say, well, I'll get there. And then they burn out and they're not earning enough money, and they can't maintain the operation. So that was really important. Holistic management really does bring that whole economic business viability piece to the fore. Now, Tao, just to let you know, I know her because we share a publisher, and she wrote this book called Beyond the War on Invasive Species. And it says a permaculture approach to ecosystem restoration, but it's also a holistic management approach, because, as she says, invasive species is a management issue. It's not a matter of that there's a separate entity these species with evil intent. Rather, it's how do we manage for the species that we want? And that's a holistic management way of looking at things. So she's hoping with her work, by integrating the two, we can get to a larger view. And it's not just getting rid of what we don't want, but enhancing what we do want by looking at the full picture. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I would love to hear questions because I want to hear what you're interested in and how I can elaborate on holistic management and permaculture.
Yeah, thanks for that. That was really great. It's really, it's so interesting to me that the two things seem to have like developed sort of side by side, but not talking to each other when they do seem like two pieces of a greater whole, right? And I was also struck by the thought that this is something, like both ideas, I'm not sure that holistic management fully would be applicable to just managing your lake home property, but there are certainly aspects of it, and much of what we as Wisconsin Lakes promote as far as lakeshore, sustainable lakeshore development, has a lot to do with ideas of permaculture and managing that very small strip of land right on the shore of your lake to mimic nature and best keep runoff from getting into the lake, just like we're trying to do with encourage farmers to do as well in the Red Cedar Basin. We had a couple of specific questions or comments. One asked, would swales work in sandy soils? So maybe you can expand on that to how different environments impact how you make decisions under these two systems.
Right. Yeah. So, like all of the tools in permaculture, they're not, nothing is appropriate for all contexts. And sandy soils are not great for swales. Now, with sandy soils, you may be in a good position to have a pond, a lined pond. That's another way to hold water in the landscape and keep water, um, available. There's another permaculture practitioner who's really gone on to do wonderful things. His name is Zach Weiss, and he has a company called Elemental Ecosystems. And he's still a young fellow, but he has vast experience of building water retention landscapes all around the world. He trained with someone named Sepp Holzer, who's one of the kind of elders of permaculture. And Sepp Holzer's done some amazing work, including a place called Tamera in Portugal, where they created these big ponds that have transformed the landscape. This is a very degraded, desertified landscape, and now is just this like biodiverse, like beautiful spot that you would just want to linger in. But Zach Weiss, Elemental Ecosystems, there may be even on his website some understanding of some options of what might be other ways of working with water in the landscape. He's also developing an interactive educational platform called waterstories.app. And people who are interested in water, I would encourage you, and the helping water, being on the side of water, I would encourage you to check that out, because he's certainly looking for people to be engaged and to help him and his team know what would be most helpful. So yeah, not every situation is ripe for every tool. So I'm really glad that that question was asked. Yeah, so in Alberta, it was very clay, very heavy clay soil. And I think that does lend itself to swales. And in my region, that it's also very dense clay soils.
Someone in the chat comments that economics is vital to success in any system of land management. I think you kind of touched on that. And in closing, I guess the last question I would ask is, I was struck by the comment that holistic management is really something where you're knowing, you're not planning to succeed at what you're planning. It's really, I've heard it not in the holistic management context, but in other planning context terms, is that you don't set goals, you set directions.
Mhm.
And I wonder if you have anything to add to that thought, because I think that's really important in terms of planning, no matter what it is, whether it's land
Yeah,
management or anything else.
right. So I think that really brings humility into the picture. Just knowing that you're going to be wrong. With holistic management, it's understood that you are dealing with complexity. When you're managing land, the variations are the weather, what happens upstream that you may not have control over, the behavior of the animals that you may not have control over, perhaps the condition the animals were in when they arrived at your property, if you haven't raised those animals yourself. But there are all these different factors of the changing of different conditions around the landscape. So with holistic management, so like your one aspect of the complexity may be the changes through the season. So one piece of your land may be a place where in the spring birds are nesting. So you need to integrate that into your planning so you don't have the cattle or the sheep or whatever on that particular piece of land during that particular piece of time. So you are humble amidst all of the complexity and the unknowns. So you assume that you're going to be wrong somehow, that it's going to be a drier year than you had anticipated, that the animals are going to pose challenges in a certain way. The people you work with will have conflicts, that maybe someone will leave and you need to readjust because you don't have that particular personnel to handle particular operations.
And I think the whole concept of being humble enough to admit that you know that there are going to be problems also applies to running a week-long online conference about water too. So life lessons that cross all sorts of boundaries. Well, it has been so great to talk to you. I wish we could keep this going for the whole morning, but we do have to move on. So thank you so much. Best of luck in all that you do in the future. And we here at the Red Cedar Watershed Conference and at Wisconsin Water Week in general, we hope you are able to come to Wisconsin and join us sometime
Well,
for
I
one of these
certainly
events. It
hope so.
would be really great. So thank you again, Judith.
Wonderful.
And we'll be moving on to our next session here just in a little bit, everyone. Adam Reimer will be giving our keynote address at 11:30. So thanks for joining us, everybody.